Hello, my name is Francisco Javier Renteria. This brief presentation will contain a form and analysis of the major components within Beethoven's Scherzo movement in his Ninth Symphony. The second movement, Molto Vivace, is composed in a ternary format, contains three big sections, scherzo, trio, scherzo, and within each of the scherzo sections in the movement, a complete sonata form exists. Each of these three sections center around a very specific tonality. The prominent tonal center of the scherzo sections are in D minor, while the trio centers around D major. The movement opens with a recurring rhythmic motif that prevails throughout the entirety of the movement. Dotted quarter, eighth quarter. It is introduced as four big statements in the following families in this order: strings, timpani, and tutti. It outlines a tonic and dominant tonal function over D and A, and it sounds like this. The first theme found in the scherzo is introduced by the violins in the key of D minor. One of the most unique characteristics of this movement is how Beethoven introduces this first theme. He does it over a five-part fugue with entrances in this following order: violin, viola, cello, violin, and finally bass. After the conclusion of the five entrances, Beethoven makes use of a pedal point over concert A, which functions as the dominant of D minor. He uses this to create tension into the vertically aligned tutti at a double forte dynamic. The statement of theme 1 concludes with a G major sonority as a preparation for the modulatory bridge. The modulatory bridge within the scherzo introduces a legato line that is juxtaposed against the rhythmic motif found in the beginning. The modulation to C major is again emphasized by the G major tonality at the end of the phrase. The second theme is introduced by the woodwinds in the key of C major, and the strings play the rhythmic motif underneath the texture. This is an unusual modulation, as we would expect possibly for the second theme to be introduced in F major. The second theme concludes with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major. The brief coda that follows features a return to the rhythmic motif from the beginning. The coda modulates to the repeating exposition. The beginning section of the development makes use of sequential rising chromatic restatements of the rhythmic motif found in the introduction. Within the development, there appears markings on the score, ritmo de 3 battute and ritmo de 4 battute in the score, that emphasize the hypermeter qualities of the scherzo phrasing. Usually conducted and observed in 1, that would be the scherzo, macrometer, the phrase appears in a triple or quadruple measure, depending on the marking on the score, which is the macro. I've included arrows to indicate the strong macro feeling of the downbeat, or rather the phrase. Here you can see that I've changed the color of the arrow. Ritmo di 4 battute. Now you can see that the grouping is in 4 rather than 3, which we had experienced in the previous slides. The retransition into the recapitulation makes use of pedal point and restatements of the rhythmic motif. The trumpet introduces a triplet measure to further emphasize the arrival of the recapitulation, and furthermore, the recapitulation is introduced as a tutti, whereas in the exposition, theme 1 was introduced as a fugato. Both are in the key of D minor. The transition appears in a similar style to the modulatory bridge found in the exposition. The legato line contrasts the rhythmic motif underneath the texture. One would expect that the second theme within the recapitulation appears in its tonic key, which would be D minor. However, here we can observe that Beethoven introduces it in the sonority of D major with a slight modulation of one note to go to D minor in the second phrase. The second theme concludes with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor. The brief codetta features a return of the rhythmic motif from the beginning. The codetta modulates to the repeat into the development. This repeat is sometimes omitted in performance practice. The conclusion of the scherzo section morphs into the trio section of the movement, the presto, and Beethoven, in a way, elisions these two sections by making use of the tonic and dominant pitches, D and A, which obviously function in D minor and D major. The middle section, the trio section, develops two main ideas presented in major tonalities. The section makes use of extensive and multiple pedal points. Conclusive cadences are very prominent. Harmonic texture is thin and pace is slowed down. The rhythmic motif is absent during this section, that is, the dotted quarter, eighth quarter motif that we had been witnessing up until this point. In the trio, the first idea is in the key of D major and will be the prominent line of this whole section. The counterpoint line underneath drives the phrase. The second idea of the trio is somewhat of an inversion of the counterpoint present in the first idea. The articulation and the contour are different. In the first idea, it's staccato In the second idea, it's legato. In the first idea, it goes down, descends. In the second idea, it ascends. A brief musical quote of the beginning of the Ode to Joy from Movement 4 can be heard as the trio section reaches its conclusion. You can hear it in the oboe. And this is just my opinion. So here is the actual Ode to Joy. And here is the conclusion of the trio. And if you focus on the oboe, obviously it's slower, but it's kind of like a skeleton of the Ode to Joy melody. The end of the trio section fermatas over a G minor chord in the key of D major that is mode mixture. It should be major, but instead it's minor. And in D minor, that obviously fits. And so the reason why that's important is because we will go into the scherzo da capo. The scherzo da capo section is pretty much a repeat of the scherzo, and so I've created this outline for us to follow through with perspective slide numbers for your convenience. The scherzo da capo returns with the recurring rhythmic motif introduction. This has prevailed throughout the entirety of the scherzo sections. The first theme is introduced in a 5-part fugato. Entrances are in the following order: violin, viola, cello, violin, bass. The modulating bridge modulates to C major, cadencing at G. The second theme is presented in C major, and the codetta follows. The development in the da capo section and the recapitulation are exactly the same. They have the same exact number of measures, the same markings, etc. The biggest difference, though, is the presence of an actual coda. Up until this point, I had been calling them codettas, but this coda it has an absence of repeating back to the development. And of course, within the recap, the first theme is still in D minor, and the second theme is in D major and briefly modulates to D minor. The coda begins with a 4-measure idea that is compressed into 2 measures, then compressed into 1 measure. You can see the compression here illustrated in the slide, and obviously these are derived from the rhythmic motif and from the melody. The compression, in addition to stringendo il tempo, dramatizes the conclusion of what we believe is the end. And the reason why I bold the word believe is because Beethoven, in his genius, gives us one last surprise before the conclusion of the movement. As we near the end of the second movement, a brief phrase from the trio section is present. Beethoven also does this in his fourth movement, in which he quotes little sections from each of the previous movements, and this is how Beethoven concludes the second movement of the Ninth Symphony. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for taking time to listen to it. I've included 2 links. The first is a reference recording for the audio used throughout the presentation, and the second is a reference score for the musical material excerpts used throughout the presentation.